A racist police officer stops two black women in a car, and he didn't know who was in the back seat. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's dive in. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting the landscape in warm hues of orange and purple. The empty road snaked between the low hills, its silence interrupted only by the soft hum of an engine. Amanda Carter sat behind the wheel of an unremarkable car, her gaze steady on the road ahead. Her hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, her posture relaxed, though her mind remained alert. Years of training had taught her how to remain calm in the face of tension, and today was no different. Beside her in the back seat, Elizabeth Warren sat straight, her gaze fixed outside the window. She was a woman in her mid-40s, with a commanding presence that required no effort. Dressed in simple, discreet clothing, she appeared unassuming to the casual observer, but Amanda knew better. Elizabeth had led countless high-stakes missions, navigating through perilous situations with unflinching resolve. Though they were traveling under the guise of ordinary citizens, it was clear that Elizabeth was used to being in charge. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, but the weight of the mission loomed large. They were on their way to the neighboring town's police station, where important documents awaited them. Documents critical to their operation. For now, the journey was smooth, but Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. As the road wound through the hills, Amanda's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. Elizabeth remained silent, her expression calm, but Amanda knew the older woman's mind was always working, calculating, preparing for every possibility. The stillness of the road was suddenly interrupted by the distant glow of headlights. Amanda's grip tightened slightly on the wheel as she saw the lights of a police car parked in the distance, blocking the road. Her heart rate quickened, though she kept her expression neutral. She didn't slow the car immediately, allowing it to roll forward as she quickly assessed the situation. In the back seat, Elizabeth shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing at the sight of the patrol car. She said nothing, but Amanda could sense her attention sharpen. The silence between them thickened as they approached the police car. Amanda exhaled slowly, keeping her movements measured. She knew this could be trouble. The officer standing beside the patrol car raised his hand, signaling for Amanda to stop. She complied, slowing the vehicle and pulling it to the side of the road. The tension in the air was palpable, but Amanda kept her demeanor calm as she rolled down the window. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Car documents and your ID, please," the officer said, his voice harsh and clipped. He was tall and stern, his face devoid of emotion, but there was something in his tone, something hostile. Amanda reached for the documents with a steady hand, taking her time before handing them over. She could feel the officer's eyes scrutinizing her, lingering longer than necessary. His gaze was sharp, cold, and filled with a judgment she had encountered many times before. "What are you doing around here?" the officer asked. His tone was more pointed now. "Not many people like you pass through here." Amanda kept her voice polite, her expression neutral. "I'm heading to the neighboring town. Business." The officer's frown deepened, clearly unsatisfied with her answer. His eyes flicked toward the back seat, where Elizabeth sat in complete silence, her posture as stiff and commanding as ever. "And who's she?" the officer asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "She seems pretty quiet." Amanda glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, meeting Elizabeth's steady gaze. She knew that Elizabeth wouldn't intervene unless absolutely necessary. It was up to her to handle this situation. "She's an acquaintance," Amanda said smoothly. "We're traveling together to take care of some matters." The officer stepped back, still holding the documents, his eyes never leaving Amanda's face. He crossed his arms, his posture rigid, as if evaluating her response. "Well, ma'am," he said after a long pause, his voice dripping with condescension, "just be aware that we'll be keeping an eye on you. Outsiders tend to get into trouble around here." With that, he handed the documents back and gave her a thin, humorless smile before turning and walking back to his patrol car. Amanda didn't react outwardly, though she could feel the tension in her shoulders. She started the car again, pulling back onto the road without a word. In the back seat, Elizabeth remained silent, her gaze still fixed out the window. There was no need for words between them. They both knew what had just happened. As the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness settled over the road, Amanda's thoughts churned. She had handled the situation as best she could, but the encounter left her unsettled. The officer's hostility wasn't just about authority, it was about prejudice, and that was something she had faced too many times in her life. The road ahead stretched out in front of them, now swallowed by the darkness of night. Amanda kept her eyes on the path, her body still tense from the encounter. She didn't speak, and neither did Elizabeth, though the charged silence in the car spoke volumes. The patrol car's lights disappeared in the distance, but the weight of the interaction lingered in the air. Amanda knew that they had narrowly avoided a more serious confrontation, but the underlying tension gnawed at her. She had been trained to remain calm under pressure, but it didn't make the experience any less exhausting. After a few more minutes of silence, Elizabeth's voice finally broke the quiet. "You handled him well," she said, her tone calm but firm. Amanda nodded, keeping her eyes on the road. "Thank you, ma'am. It's the kind of situation I was already expecting." Elizabeth let out a soft sigh, a rare show of emotion for her. "Yes, I noticed, but we shouldn't have to deal with this." Amanda didn't respond immediately. She knew Elizabeth was right. They were on a mission, and the last thing they needed was to attract unwanted attention. But in situations like this, attention was inevitable. "I've faced worse," Amanda said quietly after a moment. "But this mission, we can't afford any distractions." Elizabeth's gaze remained steady, though her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. "We'll have to be careful. The officer may have let us go, but he didn't trust us. There's a good chance he's watching us now." Amanda nodded again. "I'll keep an eye out." As they continued down the road, the lights of a small town began to appear on the horizon. The tension that had built up during the encounter with the officer slowly began to dissipate, but the feeling of being watched lingered. They both knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be filled with obstacles, and they would need to stay vigilant. The mission was too important to fail. As the car rolled into the outskirts of the town, Amanda's eyes swept over the landscape. The dimly lit streets were quiet, the kind of silence that hung heavily in the air, amplifying the sound of their engine. The few shops that lined the main road were closed, their windows darkened, and the street lamps flickered weakly, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Elizabeth, sitting in the back seat, had not spoken since their brief exchange earlier. Her silence was more than just contemplation. It was the calm before the inevitable storm. Amanda could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them both. They were nearing the police station where they would retrieve the necessary documents. But it was clear that Derek Cole, the officer who had stopped them earlier, was not done with them. Amanda pulled the car to a stop a few blocks from the station, as Elizabeth had instructed. Parking directly in front of the station would draw too much attention, and they couldn't afford that. They needed to get in and out quietly, without attracting more suspicion. "Remember the plan," Elizabeth said, her voice low and controlled. "We get the documents, avoid unnecessary confrontation, and leave as discreetly as possible." Amanda nodded, checking the rearview mirror one last time. The road behind them was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They stepped out of the car, moving quickly and quietly down the side street. Amanda kept her pace even, her eyes scanning the shadows, while Elizabeth walked with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. They reached the police station's side entrance, a door tucked away in the shadow of a narrow alley. It had been prearranged as their entry point, chosen specifically for its lack of visibility. Elizabeth gave a small nod to Amanda before she knocked lightly on the door. After a moment, it creaked open to reveal Sergeant Frank Matthews, a middle-aged officer with a neatly trimmed gray beard. His face was serious, but there was a flicker of recognition and respect in his eyes when he saw Elizabeth. "Colonel Warren," Matthews said, stepping aside to let them in. "Everything is ready." Amanda followed Elizabeth into the building, her senses still on high alert. The station was quiet, with only a few officers working the night shift, most of them preoccupied with routine tasks. As they moved through the narrow hallways, the tension that had been simmering earlier began to grow again. They both knew they were in hostile territory. Matthews led them to a small, dimly lit room at the back of the station. A single table sat in the center, with a folder of documents waiting on top of it. "These are the reports and evidence you requested," Matthews said, gesturing toward the folder. "Everything is here. I made sure nothing was altered." Elizabeth stepped forward, her expression serious as she skimmed the documents. Amanda stood by the door, her arms crossed, her attention split between the room and the hallway outside. "Good work, Sergeant," Elizabeth said after a moment, closing the folder. "This will be invaluable." Matthews gave a curt nod. "Do you need anything else?" "No, that will be all," Elizabeth replied, tucking the folder under her arm. "We'll leave the way we came." As they turned to leave, Amanda caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway outside the room. Her muscles tensed instinctively, and she stepped closer to the door, peering out into the corridor. A figure moved past the far end of the hall, tall, broad-shouldered, with a familiar gait. Derek. Amanda's heart quickened. It was him, and he was not supposed to be here. Her instincts told her he was looking for trouble, and his presence was far from a coincidence. "We need to move," Amanda whispered to Elizabeth, her voice low but urgent. Elizabeth's eyes flicked toward the door, her expression calm but resolute. "Let's go. Keep it quiet." They slipped out of the room, Amanda leading the way as they retraced their steps back toward the side entrance. The station was still quiet, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut through. Amanda's every nerve was on edge as they moved down the hallway, her ears straining for any sound that indicated Derek might be close. They reached the side door without incident, but Amanda's instinct screamed at her that something was wrong. She opened the door slowly, checking the alleyway outside. The street was empty, but that didn't mean they were in the clear. "Let's move," Elizabeth said, her voice a whisper. They stepped out into the alley, the cool night air a stark contrast to the stifling tension inside the station. Amanda's eyes darted up and down the street, searching for any sign of Derek's patrol car. The town seemed just as deserted as it had when they arrived, but Amanda knew better than to trust appearances. They walked quickly, the police station fading behind them as they neared the car. But before they could reach the vehicle, the headlights of a familiar patrol car illuminated the street ahead of them. Derek's car. Amanda's breath hitched. He had been waiting for them. The patrol car pulled to a stop a few feet in front of their parked vehicle, its headlights casting long shadows down the deserted street. Derek stepped out, his tall frame backlit by the glow of the street lamp overhead. He stood with a cocky, smug smile on his face, the same one Amanda had seen earlier. His hand rested on the holster at his waist, a silent reminder of the power he wielded. "Well," Derek said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like we meet again, ladies." Amanda moved to stand slightly in front of Elizabeth, her posture calm but protective. She knew Derek wasn't here for another routine check. This was personal now. "We're just passing through," Amanda said, her voice steady. "There's no need for trouble." Derek's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Trouble? I decide who gets into trouble around here, and it looks to me like you've got something to hide." Elizabeth, who had remained silent so far, finally spoke. "We're not here for any problems, officer. We're leaving now." Derek's eyes flicked toward Elizabeth, but it was clear his focus was on Amanda. There was something in his gaze, a twisted satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Not so fast," Derek said, stepping closer. "I think I'll take a look at your friend's documents this time." Amanda's pulse quickened. They couldn't afford to let Derek get any closer. The mission depended on staying under the radar, and Derek was pushing them toward a confrontation they couldn't afford. "We've already shown you everything," Amanda said, her voice controlled. "There's no reason for this." Derek ignored her, his attention now fully on Elizabeth. He stepped closer, trying to peer into the shadows of her face. Amanda could see Elizabeth's posture stiffen, but the older woman remained calm. "Why don't you come out where I can see you, ma'am?" Derek said, his tone taunting. Elizabeth remained still, her gaze locked on Derek. "We're leaving now." Derek's smile faltered for a moment, and for the first time, Amanda saw uncertainty in his eyes. Elizabeth's calm, authoritative tone had thrown him off, and he didn't quite know how to react. But it was only a brief hesitation before his smirk returned. "Is that so?" Derek sneered. "Well, I think I'll be the judge of that." Amanda's body tensed. She could feel the situation spiraling out of control. If Derek pushed any further, there was no telling how it would end. Before she could say anything, Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "Officer, I suggest you step back." Derek blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in her tone. "Excuse me." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, her voice now cold and commanding. "Step back, now." Derek hesitated, clearly unsettled by the sudden change in Elizabeth's demeanor. Amanda could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to decide whether to push further or retreat. But something in Elizabeth's tone, something unyielding, made him take a step back. Amanda exhaled slowly, her muscles still coiled with tension. She knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "We're leaving," Elizabeth repeated, her voice steady. Derek's eyes narrowed, but after a long moment of silence, he stepped aside, allowing them to pass. The smug smile was gone from his face, replaced by a cold glare. "We'll be watching," Derek muttered as they walked past him. Amanda didn't respond, her focus entirely on getting Elizabeth to the car and leaving this town behind. But as they got into the car and drove away, Amanda knew that Derek wasn't going to let this go. He had seen something in them, something that unsettled him, and she had a sinking feeling that this wouldn't be the last time they could. The drive out of town was tense and quiet. Amanda's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing through the events of the last few hours. Derek had backed off, but only because Elizabeth had exerted her authority. He would be watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. And the next time, Amanda wasn't sure they would be able to avoid confrontation. Elizabeth sat in the back seat, the folder of documents resting on her lap. Her expression was unreadable, but Amanda knew that she was thinking through their next steps just as meticulously as she always did. As the town's lights faded into the distance, Amanda let out a slow breath, trying to shake off the lingering tension. "What now?" Amanda asked quietly, her voice breaking the silence. Elizabeth looked up from the folder, her eyes sharp. "We finished the mission." Amanda nodded. She knew what that meant. They would need to get to the next phase of their operation without attracting more attention. But after the encounter with Derek, Amanda's gut told her that things were about to get much more complicated. "Derek won't let this go," Amanda said, her tone cautious. "He's watching us." Elizabeth's lips pressed into a thin line. "I know, but we'll be ready for him if he tries anything." The night stretched out before them, the road dark and seemingly endless. The mission was far from over, and Amanda could feel the weight of what was to come pressing down on her. But for now they had escaped the lion's den. How long that would last, Amanda wasn't sure. The road stretched out before them, dark and winding, but Amanda's focus never wavered. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she glanced at the rearview mirror. The town was far behind them, but the lingering sense of danger weighed heavily on her. Derek was still out there, and the encounter at the police station had left a bitter taste in her mouth. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done with them. Elizabeth, sitting in the back seat, was uncharacteristically quiet. She had been calm and collected during the confrontation with Derek, but Amanda knew her too well to believe that it hadn't affected her. The mission was delicate, and any attention from the local authorities could derail everything. They were so close to getting what they needed, but Derek's interference was a threat they couldn't ignore. "We can't afford another run-in with him," Amanda muttered, mostly to herself, but Elizabeth responded anyway. "We'll handle it," Elizabeth said, her voice steady but with an edge of tension. "We've handled worse." Amanda wanted to believe that, but something about Derek's persistence gnawed at her. He had backed down at the station, but that wasn't because he had given up. He was waiting, watching, and Amanda feared that he was planning something worse than before. Her suspicions were confirmed when the headlights of a familiar patrol car appeared in the rearview mirror. Her pulse quickened as the glow of the lights grew closer. Derek had found them. "He's back," Amanda said, her voice low but urgent. Elizabeth's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, her expression hardening. "Don't let him force us into a corner." Amanda pressed her foot on the gas, speeding up slightly, but Derek's patrol car followed closely behind. He wasn't letting them go this time. Amanda's heart raced as she weighed her options. They couldn't afford to get into a high-speed chase, but they also couldn't risk another confrontation on the road. "I'll turn off at the next road," Amanda said, making a quick decision. "We can lose him in the back roads." Elizabeth gave a curt nod, her focus on the rapidly approaching headlights behind them. The tension in the car was palpable, but both women were prepared for whatever came next. Amanda spotted a narrow dirt road up ahead and took the turn sharply, the tires kicking up dust as the car veered off the main road. The patrol car followed them, its headlights bouncing erratically over the uneven ground. Amanda's hands tightened on the wheel as the road grew narrower, flanked by dense trees on either side. The dirt road led them deeper into a secluded area, a place Amanda knew was far from any main routes. It was the perfect place to lose someone, but also a perfect place for a confrontation. The old abandoned warehouse that had once served as a smuggling hub loomed ahead, its rusted gates standing like sentinels against the night. "We'll make our stand here," Amanda said, her voice firm. "He wants to corner us. Let's give him what he's looking for." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, but there was a glint of approval in her gaze. "We can't let him push us any further, but we need to control the situation." Amanda pulled the car to a stop in front of the warehouse, her heart pounding in her chest. They both knew what was coming next. Derek wasn't just chasing them, he was hunting them. Before they could exit the vehicle, Derek's patrol car skidded to a stop a few yards behind them. The headlights flickered, casting an eerie glow on the warehouse's rusted exterior. Amanda glanced over at Elizabeth, who gave her a silent nod. They stepped out of the car, ready to face what was coming. Derek emerged from his patrol car, the same smug grin plastered on his face. His hand rested on the holster at his side, a silent threat. The cocky confidence he had displayed earlier was now mixed with something more dangerous, a hunger for control. "You didn't think you could just run away, did you?" Derek called out, his voice taunting. He stepped forward, his boots crunching over the gravel. "You two have a lot of explaining to do." Amanda felt the weight of the confrontation settling over her, but she refused to let Derek intimidate her. She stood on her ground, her eyes locked on him. Elizabeth, as always, was composed, her gaze cold and unyielding. "There's nothing to explain," Amanda said, her voice steady. "We're leaving, and there's nothing you can do to stop us." Derek chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Oh, I think there is. You see, I don't like outsiders coming into my town and thinking they can just do whatever they want. I have the authority here, and you're going to answer to me." Elizabeth stepped forward then, her presence commanding as she spoke. "Officer, I suggest you reconsider your actions. You don't know who you're dealing with." Derek's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Two women who think they're above the law." Amanda could feel the situation escalating, the tension tightening like a noose around them. Derek wasn't going to back down. Not this time. He had something to prove, and they were in his crosshairs. "What do you want, Derek?" Amanda asked, her voice sharp. "What's your endgame here?" Derek's eyes darkened, and his hand moved to grip the handle of his gun. "What I want is for you to understand that in my town, you follow my rules. I don't care who you are or where you come from. Out here, I'm the law." The air crackled with the threat of violence, but before Derek could take another step, Elizabeth raised her hand, stopping him in his tracks. "We're done playing games," Elizabeth said, her voice cold and authoritative. "You don't know who you're dealing with, and I strongly suggest you walk away before you make the biggest mistake of your career." Derek hesitated, his hand still hovering over his gun. For the first time, Amanda saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He wasn't expecting Elizabeth's calm, calculated response. "And if I don't?" Derek challenged, his voice less certain now. Elizabeth stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "If you don't, you'll regret it. Because this time, we're not just ordinary citizens passing through your town. We're federal agents on a mission far more important than your petty power games." Derek's face paled, his smug grin vanishing in an instant. His hand dropped away from his holster, his eyes widening in shock. "Federal agents," he stammered, taking a step back. "But I didn't know." "You didn't know because we didn't want you to know," Elizabeth said, her voice ice cold. "But you forced our hand. Now step back, walk away, and if you try to stop us again, I'll make sure your badge is revoked by morning." Derek blinked, clearly struggling to process what was happening. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and he was no longer in control. Amanda watched as his arrogance crumbled, replaced by fear and uncertainty. "I didn't mean," Derek mumbled, backing away slowly. "You meant every word," Elizabeth said, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. "But now you'll live with the consequences. Get in your car and leave." Derek stood frozen for a moment, but then he quickly turned and hurried back to his patrol car, his bravado completely shattered. He slammed the door shut and sped away, the sound of his tires kicking up gravel as he disappeared into the darkness. As the patrol car's taillights faded into the night, Amanda let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The tension in her body slowly began to unwind, but the adrenaline still coursed through her veins. Elizabeth, ever composed, stood silently for a moment, watching the road where Derek had disappeared. Her expression was unreadable, but Amanda knew the older woman well enough to know that she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "That was close," Amanda muttered, rubbing the back of her neck. Elizabeth finally turned to her gaze sharp but calm. "We'll need to move quickly. Derek may be scared off for now, but he's not the only threat we face." Amanda nodded, her mind racing through their next steps. They avoided a disaster tonight, but the mission was far from over. And now that Derek knew who they were, things would only get more complicated. "What's our next move?" Amanda asked, falling back into her role as Elizabeth's trusted partner. Elizabeth's lips pressed into a thin line. "We need to finish the mission, but we'll have to be more careful from here on out. Derek will be watching us, and we can't afford any more mistakes." Amanda agreed, though a part of her couldn't shake the lingering anger from the confrontation. Derek had pushed them to the brink, and while they had managed to avoid a full-blown disaster, the memory of his smug face still burned in her mind. They returned to the car, the quiet night settling around them once more. The tension that had built up during the encounter slowly began to dissipate, but both women knew that this wasn't over. As Amanda started the engine and pulled away from the warehouse, she cast one last glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Derek's patrol car following them again. But the road was empty, and the only sound was the soft hum of the engine. "We can't let our guard down," Elizabeth said quietly, as if reading Amanda's thoughts. "I know," Amanda replied, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "This isn't over yet." The road stretched out in front of them, disappearing into the night as the hum of the engine filled the silence between Amanda and Elizabeth. The tension from the confrontation with Derek still hung in the air, and Amanda's grip on the steering wheel was tighter than usual. Though they had managed to escape the situation without violence, the weight of what had almost happened pressed heavily on her chest. Elizabeth, as always, was composed, though Amanda could sense the strain beneath her calm exterior. She hadn't said much since Derek had driven away, and the quiet in the car was suffocating. Amanda glanced at Elizabeth in the rearview mirror, wondering what was going through her mind. She had always admired Elizabeth's ability to remain unflappable in the face of danger, but this time, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that they had barely escaped something much worse. For a while they drove in silence, the darkness of the countryside enveloping them. Amanda's mind raced with thoughts of what could have happened, what might still happen. Derek was gone, but that didn't mean they were in the clear. The encounter had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. Finally, unable to stand the silence any longer, Amanda spoke. "We got lucky back there," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Too close for comfort." Elizabeth shifted in the back seat, her gaze still fixed on the road ahead. "It wasn't luck," she said, her tone measured. "We handled it. That's all that matters." Amanda's jaw tightened. She respected Elizabeth's confidence, but part of her couldn't just brush off what had happened. Derek had pushed them to the edge, and the tension still lingered in her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. "Handled?" Amanda repeated, her voice edged with frustration. "He nearly pulled a gun on us, and if he had?" Elizabeth's gaze finally met Amanda's in the rearview mirror, her eyes sharp but calm. "He didn't, and if he had, we would have dealt with it." Amanda exhaled through her nose, her frustration simmering just below the surface. She wanted to believe that Elizabeth was right, that they had been in control the whole time, but the truth was they had been at Derek's mercy for those few tense moments. And Amanda hated that feeling. "We shouldn't have let him push us like that," Amanda muttered, more to herself than to Elizabeth. "He got to call the shots, and we just reacted." Elizabeth's voice remained steady. "Amanda, you did exactly what you were supposed to do. You stayed calm. You didn't escalate the situation. That's what keeps us alive." The words made sense, but they didn't ease the anger boiling in Amanda's chest. She had spent years training for moments like this, training to control her emotions, to think clearly under pressure. But being face to face with someone like Derek, with his blatant abuse of power and prejudice, had stirred something deeper in her. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was personal. The car's engine hummed in the background, filling the space between Amanda and Elizabeth as the tension built. Amanda knew she shouldn't press further, but the frustration gnawed at her, demanding release. "It's not enough," Amanda said, her voice sharper now. We can't just keep playing it safe, letting people like Derek think they can get away with this. It's always the same. They throw their weight around, intimidate, and we're supposed to stay quiet because we have a bigger mission. Elizabeth's expression remained calm, but Amanda could see the slight tightening of her jaw. We have a responsibility, Amanda. We can't afford to get distracted by every personal battle. That's not how we win. And what if that personal battle is part of the bigger picture? Amanda shot back, her frustration bubbling over. What if every time we let people like Derek push us around, we're just reinforcing the idea that they can get away with it? Elizabeth didn't respond immediately, her eyes narrowing as she considered Amanda's words. For a long moment, the car was filled with silence, the tension thick between them. Finally, Elizabeth spoke, her voice quieter but no less firm. I understand how you feel, but we can't lose sight of the mission. If we confronted Derek the way you wanted, it wouldn't have ended well. We would have been exposed, and the entire operation would have been compromised. Amanda clenched her jaw, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She knew Elizabeth was right, on a rational level at least. But the emotional toll of what had happened weighed heavily on her. Every encounter like this felt like a blow that chipped away at her resolve, a reminder of how much work still needed to be done and how little seemed to change. So what are we supposed to do? Amanda asked, her voice filled with bitterness. Just keep swallowing it? Keep pretending like it doesn't affect us? Elizabeth's gaze softened, though her tone remained steady. We don't pretend it doesn't affect us. Deal with it. But we deal with it strategically. You're right. Derek's behavior was unacceptable, but we can't let him derail us. We have a responsibility to stay focused. Amanda let out a frustrated sigh, feeling torn between her anger and her respect for Elizabeth's leadership. She knew Elizabeth wasn't wrong, but it didn't make the situation any easier to stomach. I just don't know how much longer I can keep doing this, Amanda admitted, her voice softer now. Every time we let something like this slide, it feels like we're losing a little bit of the fight. Elizabeth remained silent for a moment, then leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but resolute. I've been doing this a long time, Amanda, and I've had to make a lot of difficult decisions that didn't always feel right in the moment. But I've learned that the bigger battles are the ones we fight when we're in a position of power. And right now, we're not in that position. But we will be. If we stay focused, we will be. Amanda's shoulders sagged slightly, her anger giving way to exhaustion. She respected Elizabeth deeply, more than anyone she had ever worked with. But the weight of the mission, combined with the constant strain of facing people like Derek, was starting to take its toll. I hope you're right, Amanda said quietly, her voice tinged with weariness. Elizabeth's gaze softened. I am. You just have to trust the process. We'll get there. The rest of the drive passed in silence, but the tension between them shifted. Amanda wasn't sure if she felt better, but Elizabeth's words had given her something to hold on to, something to believe in. The night air was thick as they approached the small town again. Amanda's mind churned with a mix of frustration and focus, the echoes of her earlier conversation with Elizabeth still lingering. The mission was far from over, and despite their escape from Derek, the road ahead felt more treacherous than ever. The faint glow of the police station's lights came into view, casting long shadows across the quiet street. Amanda's muscles tensed involuntarily as she glanced over at Elizabeth, who, despite everything, remained as composed as ever. We'll need to get in and out quickly, Elizabeth said, her voice low but firm. Derek won't be far. He's rattled, but that makes him even more dangerous. Amanda nodded, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel as she pulled into a side street near the station. He'll be watching us. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed as she glanced around, assessing the situation with a calculated gaze. Let him watch. We can't afford to let his intimidation tactics slow us down. They parked the car a few blocks from the station, slipping into the shadows as they made their way down the street. The station itself looked quiet, but Amanda knew better. Derek was waiting, lurking somewhere in the darkness, waiting for his moment to strike. I don't like this, Amanda muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. It feels like we're walking into a trap. Elizabeth didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the station's entrance. We've faced worse. Keep your head down. We'll be in and out before he knows it. But Amanda couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at her. Every step they took toward the station felt heavier, like the weight of everything they had faced, everything they were still facing, was pressing down on her chest, and Derek, with his smug grin and blatant abuse of power, was a constant presence in her mind. They reached the side entrance of the station without incident, slipping inside and making their way through the dimly lit corridors. The station was quiet, most of the officers having gone home for the night, but Amanda's instincts screamed at her that they were being watched. Sergeant Frank Matthews met them in the hallway, his expression serious as he led them to a back room. He was one of the few allies they had in this small town, but he even seemed uneasy. "Everything's ready," Matthews said, handing Elizabeth a small envelope. "But you need to get out of here fast. Derek's been asking questions." Amanda's stomach tightened at the mention of Derek's name. She glanced over at Elizabeth, who was already skimming the contents of the envelope. "We'll be gone soon," Elizabeth said, her voice calm. "Thank you, Sergeant." Matthews nodded, but Amanda could see the tension in his posture. "Be careful. Derek's not one to let things go." As they turned to leave, Amanda felt her pulse quicken. They had what they needed, but Derek was still out there, and she knew he wouldn't just walk away from this. Not after everything that had happened. The moment they stepped out of the station, Amanda's worst fears were realized. Derek's patrol car was parked across the street, his shadowy figure leaning against the hood. His eyes were locked on them, the smirk on his face unmistakable, even in the dim light of the street lamp. "There he is," Amanda muttered, her muscles tensing as she glanced at Elizabeth. "He's not going to let us go without a fight." Elizabeth's gaze was hard, her jaw set in a way that Amanda recognized as a sign of her preparing for whatever was to come. "Stay calm. We'll handle him." But Amanda wasn't calm. The anger she had been holding on to since their last confrontation with Derek flared inside her, hot and insistent. She was tired of playing by the rules, tired of letting people like Derek think they could get away with their cruelty and intimidation. Her mind raced with the thought of how easy it would be to confront him, how satisfying it would be to finally stand up to him. But Elizabeth's calm voice cut through her thoughts. "Amanda," she said quietly but firmly, "don't let him control the situation. Stay focused." Amanda clenched her fists, trying to push down the anger that threatened to boil over. Derek was still watching them, his smirk widening as he pushed off from the car and began walking toward them. "Well, look who's back," Derek called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I thought you two would have learned your lesson by now." Amanda gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay still. Derek stopped a few feet away, his eyes gleaming with malice. "What's in the envelope, huh?" he asked, gesturing toward the papers Elizabeth held. "Something you don't want me to see?" Elizabeth's voice remained steady as she spoke. "We're leaving, officer. There's nothing here for you." But Derek wasn't deterred. He stepped closer, his hand casually resting on the holster at his side. "Oh, I think there is. You see, I've been keeping an eye on you two, and I've got a feeling you're up to something." Amanda's pulse quickened as Derek's words hung in the air. He was goading them, trying to provoke a reaction, and it was working. She could feel her temper rising, but Elizabeth's calm presence beside her kept her grounded. "We've done nothing wrong," Elizabeth said evenly, "and you know it." Derek's smirk widened. "Maybe, but I've got a hunch, and I think it's time we had a little chat about what you're really doing here." Amanda's heart pounded in her chest. She could see where this was heading, and she didn't like it. Derek wasn't just here to intimidate them. He wanted to assert his control, to prove that he held all the power. But this time, Amanda wasn't going to let him. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward, her voice cold and sharp. "We're not here to entertain your power trip, Derek. You've already overstepped your bounds once, and we won't let it happen again." Derek's eyes flickered with surprise, but he quickly recovered, his smirk returning. "Oh, so now you're the one calling the shots, huh? You think you can just talk to me like that and walk away?" Amanda took another step forward, her gaze locked on Derek's. "I'm not afraid of you. You've been playing this game for far too long, and it ends here." Derek's hand twitched near his holster, but Elizabeth's voice cut through the tension before things could escalate further. "Amanda," Elizabeth said, her tone firm but not unkind, "step back." Amanda hesitated, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. But after a moment, she took a step back, her jaw clenched. Elizabeth turned her attention to Derek, her gaze cold and steady. "You've made your point, officer, but you've also made a mistake. We have every right to be here, and you know it. If you push this any further, You'll be answering to a higher authority than you're used to. Derek's smirk faltered slightly, but his arrogance remained. He took a step back, his eyes narrowing. I'll be watching. Elizabeth didn't flinch. Do what you need to do. But we're done here. Derek lingered for a moment, his gaze flicking between Amanda and Elizabeth, but he finally turned and walked back to his patrol car, muttering something under his breath. As soon as Derek was out of earshot, Amanda let out a long breath, her body still tense from the confrontation. That was too close, Amanda muttered, running a hand through her hair. You did well, Elizabeth said, cutting her off. You kept your head. That's what matters. Amanda wasn't so sure. The confrontation with Derek had pushed her to the edge, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep holding back. The drive out of the town was quiet, the tension between Amanda and Elizabeth simmering just below the surface. Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that Derek was still watching them, lurking somewhere in the darkness. The confrontation had rattled her more than she wanted to admit, and though they had managed to escape without violence, the encounter had left a bitter taste in her mouth. Elizabeth, as always, was composed, her focus on the road ahead. But Amanda couldn't ignore the frustration building inside her. Derek had pushed them to the brink, and while they had managed to keep things from escalating, it felt like a hollow victory. We can't keep doing this, Amanda said, her voice low but edged with frustration. We can't keep letting people like Derek push us around. Elizabeth didn't respond immediately, her eyes fixed on the road. We don't let them push us around. We outsmart them. That's how we win. Amanda clenched her jaw, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She understood Elizabeth's point, but it didn't make the situation any easier to swallow. I just don't know if it's enough, Amanda muttered, more to herself than to Elizabeth. Elizabeth's gaze softened slightly as she glanced over at Amanda. It's enough for now, but we're not done yet. Derek won't be the last obstacle we face, but we'll handle it, just like we always do. Amanda nodded, though the frustration still simmered inside her. The mission was far from over, and she knew they had a long road ahead. The quiet of the night didn't last long. As Amanda and Elizabeth drove down the winding road out of town, a familiar set of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Amanda's pulse quickened. Derek wasn't finished with them. He's back, Amanda muttered, her grip tightening on the wheel. Her muscles tensed as she glanced at Elizabeth, who remained composed but alert. Elizabeth turned slightly, watching as the headlights grew closer. He's more persistent than I thought. He's not going to stop, Amanda said through gritted teeth. He's made this personal. Elizabeth nodded, her expression hardening. Then it's time we finish this. Amanda pressed down on the accelerator, the car speeding up as they tried to put more distance between them and Derek. But Derek's patrol car followed, matching their speed and closing the gap. The deserted road stretched on ahead of them, but Amanda knew that there wasn't much more room to run. They had to face him. Elizabeth's voice was calm but resolute. We'll make our stand at the next turn. There's a clearing. It'll be open enough for us to handle him. Amanda nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't need to ask what Elizabeth meant by handle him. She had been holding back for too long, but this time there would be no room for restraint. As they approached the clearing, Amanda slowed the car and pulled off the road. The headlights of Derek's patrol car illuminated the dark landscape as he followed, pulling to a stop a few yards behind them. Amanda glanced at Elizabeth, who gave her a small, determined nod. It was time. They both stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at their skin. Derek emerged from his patrol car, his smug grin plastered on his face. But this time it wasn't just arrogance that fueled him. It was anger. He was done playing games. Well, Derek called out as he approached. You just can't seem to stay out of trouble, can you? Amanda felt her pulse quicken, the anger she had been holding back bubbling to the surface. But before she could respond, Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice cold and commanding. You've overstepped your bounds, officer, Elizabeth said, her tone sharp and unyielding. This ends now. Derek's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. He took another step forward, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. You think you're going to tell me what to do? In my town? Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. You're not in control here, Derek. You never were. Derek's expression darkened, his hand inching closer to his gun. I think it's time you learned who's really in charge. Amanda's heart raced as Derek's hand hovered over his holster, the threat of violence hanging heavy in the air. She could feel the situation spiraling out of control, but she knew that this time they couldn't back down. "You're playing a dangerous game," Amanda said, her voice steady but laced with fury. "But you're about to lose." Derek's eyes flashed with anger, and in a split second, he drew his gun, pointing it at them. Amanda's breath caught in her throat, but Elizabeth didn't flinch. "You're making a mistake," Elizabeth said, her voice eerily calm. "Put the gun down, Derek. You don't want to do this." For a moment, there was silence. Derek's hand trembled slightly, the weight of the gun heavy in his grip. Amanda could see the doubt flickering in his eyes, but the anger, the desire to assert his control, was stronger. "I've had enough of your threats," Derek spat, his voice shaking with rage. "You think you can come here and tell me how to do my job? I'm the law here." Elizabeth took a step forward, her gaze locked on Derek. "You're not the law. You're a man hiding behind a badge, using it to justify your hatred and your fear." Derek's face twisted with rage, and Amanda's body tensed, ready for the worst. But Elizabeth's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You want to know who we are?" Elizabeth asked. Her tone was cold and unrelenting. "We're the ones who decide whether you walk away from this with your badge, or whether you lose everything." Derek hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" Elizabeth reached into her jacket, pulling out her credentials and holding them up for Derek to see. "We're federal agents, and if you don't put that gun down right now, you'll be facing charges that will end your career." Derek's eyes widened in shock, his grip on the gun faltering. Amanda could see the fear creeping into his expression, the realization that he had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. "You're lying," Derek said, but his voice wavered. "You're not exactly who we are," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice cold as ice. "And you know that if you pull that trigger, your life as you know it is over." The silence that followed was deafening. Amanda held her breath, her eyes locked on Derek as he stood there, gun in hand, teetering on the edge of a decision that could change everything. For a moment, it seemed like Derek might still choose violence. His hands shook, his eyes filled with rage and fear, and Amanda could almost see the wheels turning in his mind. But then, slowly, Derek's grip loosened and the gun lowered. He took a shaky step back, his expression crumbling as the weight of what he had almost done settled over him. "I didn't," Derek stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean..." Elizabeth stepped forward, her gaze unyielding. "You did, but you're lucky we're giving you a second chance. Walk away, Derek, and don't ever come near us again." Derek stood frozen for a moment longer, his face pale, before he finally lowered the gun to his side. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. Without another word, Derek turned and hurried back to his patrol car, his movements clumsy and frantic. He slammed the door shut and drove off, the roar of the engine fading into the distance. Amanda let out a long breath, her body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. She glanced over at Elizabeth, who was watching Derek's car disappear into the night, her expression unreadable. "That was close," Amanda said, her voice shaky. Elizabeth finally looked at her, her gaze softening. Too close. They stood in the clearing for a long moment, the quiet night settling around them like a blanket. The tension that had filled the air was gone, but the weight of everything that had just happened lingered. Amanda took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "I wasn't sure he was going to back down." Elizabeth's gaze was distant for a moment, as if she was still processing everything that had transpired. "He was too far gone in his need for control, but in the end, he saw reason." Amanda shook her head, a bitter taste in her mouth. "It's not enough. People like him, they just keep getting away with it. How many more Dereks are out there?" Elizabeth turned to face Amanda, her expression softer now. "There will always be people like him, but what matters is how we respond. We don't let them win. Not in the long run." Amanda's frustration was still simmering beneath the surface, but Elizabeth's calm presence had a way of grounding her, pulling her back from the edge of her anger. She knew Elizabeth was right, but it didn't make the fight any less exhausting. "So what now?" Amanda asked, her voice quieter. Elizabeth glanced at the road where Derek had disappeared, then back at Amanda. "Now we finish what we came here to do. We completed the mission, and then we move on to the next fight." Amanda nodded slowly, the weight of everything settling over her like a heavy blanket. The mission wasn't over yet. and there were still battles to be fought. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead would be long, and the fight would never be easy, but she wasn't alone in it. As they walked back to the car, the night sky stretching out above them, Amanda glanced at Elizabeth, a new sense of respect blooming in her chest. Elizabeth had been through countless battles, both personal and professional, and yet she remained unshaken, a steady force in the storm. And Amanda knew that with her by her side, they could face whatever came next. The hum of the engine was the only sound as Amanda and Elizabeth drove through the quiet night. The tension that had been so thick only moments ago was starting to dissipate, replaced by a heavy sense of exhaustion. The weight of everything that had happened, Derek's confrontation, the near violence, and the mission, settled over them both. Amanda's hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, her thoughts far away. They had managed to avoid disaster, but the encounter had left her shaken. Derek's face, twisted with anger and desperation, lingered in her mind. The way he had looked at them, as if he needed to prove something, had left a bitter taste in her mouth. Beside her, Elizabeth sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The folder of documents they had collected was safely tucked into the glove compartment, a reminder that despite the obstacles, they had succeeded in their mission. "You did well back there," Elizabeth said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Amanda glanced over at her, surprised by the compliment. "I almost lost control." Elizabeth's lips pressed into a thin smile. "But you didn't. You held it together when it mattered." Amanda exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Elizabeth's words were reassuring, but the truth was, she still felt like she had come dangerously close to crossing a line. The anger that had flared inside her during the confrontation with Derek was something she wasn't used to feeling so intensely. "We finished the mission," Amanda said, her voice quieter now. "That's what matters." Elizabeth nodded, her expression unreadable. "It's what always matters. But it doesn't mean the emotions aren't real." Amanda fell silent, her thoughts drifting back to the mission. They had done what they came to do, secured the documents, avoided a potentially disastrous confrontation, and made it out of the town in one piece. But the emotional toll of what had happened lingered, and Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that this mission, while successful, had left a deeper mark on her than she had expected. The road stretched out ahead of them, winding through the dark hills as the lights of the town disappeared in the distance. Amanda's mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. More missions, more confrontations, more battles. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a strange sense of clarity. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Hours later, Amanda sat at a small wooden desk in the safe house they had reached after completing the mission. The quiet of the room contrasted sharply with the tension of the night's events, but it gave her time to reflect. In front of her was the report she was tasked with writing, an account of the mission's success, the documents they had retrieved, and a summary of their encounter with Derek. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she thought about how to frame everything that had happened. The facts were straightforward. They had completed the mission without attracting attention from higher authorities. They had gathered the necessary intelligence, and they had avoided direct confrontation with local law enforcement, at least on the surface. But the truth was more complex. Amanda's fingers began to move across the keyboard as she typed up the mission report. She was careful, as always, to maintain a professional tone. But this time, she felt compelled to include something more, like a note, subtle but clear, about the systemic issues they had faced along the way. She wrote about Derek's behavior, his prejudice, and his misuse of power. She didn't name him directly, but she made it clear that there had been an obstacle beyond just gathering intelligence. It was an obstacle they often encountered people who wielded authority recklessly, with little regard for the lives they affected. When she finished the report, she sat back in her chair, staring at the words on the screen. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. A small call for change, embedded in the formalities of a mission report. Elizabeth entered the room then, glancing at the computer screen. "All done?" Amanda nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I wrote up everything we did. It's ready to go." Elizabeth studied her for a moment, her sharp eyes taking in more than just the surface. "You added something, didn't you?" Amanda hesitated, then nodded. "I did. I mentioned what we faced with Derek, the way he acted. It wasn't just about the mission, Liz. It was about something bigger. Elizabeth's expression softened and she moved closer, glancing at the screen. Good. It needs to be said. Even if it's just a small mention, it's important. Amanda exhaled, relieved that Elizabeth understood. Do you think it'll make a difference? Elizabeth gave a small smile, her hand resting on Amanda's shoulder. Change is slow, Amanda, but every little bit helps. What matters is that we don't stop pushing. Amanda nodded, feeling a sense of quiet resolve settle over her. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with more missions, more confrontations, and more moments where they would be forced to confront not only their enemies but the systems they were up against. But with Elizabeth by her side, she felt ready to keep fighting. As she saved the report and closed her laptop, Amanda stood and glanced at Elizabeth, who was watching her with a quiet pride. Let's get some rest, Elizabeth said softly. We've earned it. Amanda smiled faintly, the tension in her chest easing as they left the room together. The mission was complete, but the fight was far from over, and Amanda knew, deep down, that they would keep pushing, keep fighting, and keep making small, incremental changes in a world that desperately needed them. They stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around them as they looked out over the quiet landscape. The stars above were bright and clear, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always light to guide them forward. As they stood there side by side, Amanda knew that this was only the beginning. They had completed one mission, but there would be many more. And with every mission, every confrontation, they would continue to fight for the change they knew was possible. We'll keep going, Amanda said quietly, her voice filled with quiet determination. Elizabeth smiled, a look of respect and understanding passing between them. We always do. And with that, they turned back toward the safe house, ready for whatever came next. If you enjoyed this journey and want to see more stories that inspire change, hit the subscribe button below to stay updated on our latest missions.